In a very famous interview that had aired on Firing Line during the Vietnam War between conservative commentator William F. Buckley Jr. and Dr. Benjamin Spott, author of Baby and Child Care, published in 1946, a pediatrician and progressive activist. William Buckley had asked his guest whether he had held in his head a comparison of the number of people who have died during this century from disease in contrast to those who have died not from war, but rather from persecution. For instance, he posited the 6 million Jewish dead in Nazi Germany, whose number a novel coronavirus has now far surpassed in only just 2 years, half the time that had been required by Adolf Hitler during the Holocaust. On the very first anniversary of the pandemic declaration by the World Health Organization, when the total of American fatalities attributed to a novel virus, origins unknown, had exceeded 527,000, estimated to exceed then the death toll in both world wars, the conflict in Southeast Asia, underclad war and police action, and the 9/11 terror attacks. President Joe Biden, announcing the American Rescue Plan, had addressed the American general public from the White House and had remarked in observance that we were hit with a virus that had been met with silence and spread unchecked, while denials for days, weeks, then months had led to yet more deaths, more infections, more stress, and indeed more loneliness. However, on August 29, 2024, in a sworn declaration filed with the federal court in Washington, for the very first time in litigations commenced on July 7th, 2021, just 1 week before a White House crackdown on what were identified as problematic accounts on Facebook, had acknowledged that a request for documents under the Freedom of Information Act by email of March 23rd, 2021, had been received by OMB, Office of Management and Budget, and assigned a tracking number of 21-220. Even federal courts acknowledged that the vast majority of FOIA cases can be resolved rather readily on summary judgment presented by the agency. Under deference doctrine, as attorneys describe it, the government's burden is a light one because ultimately an agency's justification for invoking a FOIA exemption, one of 9, is sufficient if it appears logical or plausible. However, in this case, where a court acknowledged rather protracted history, no exemption has ever been invoked by the White House. And with respect to this request for documents, after 9 months of planning, as well as coordination with the National Security Council, according to the sworn declaration from the Deputy General Counsel for the Executive Office of the President, on August 29th, 2024, OMB had independently interpreted the plaintiff's request as seeking all OMB records pertaining to any determination that either the infectious dose, still unknown, or secondary attack rate, still unpublished, of COVID-19 or its corresponding virus, SARS-CoV-2, had warranted classification at the confidential level, a designation that shall be applied to information the unauthorized disclosure of which reasonably could be expected to cause damage to the national security, generally pertaining to foreign affairs and military affairs, and the original classification authority is able to identify or describe at the time. Under U.S. v. Nixon, absent a claim, however, of a need to protect military, diplomatic, or sensitive national security interests, we find it difficult, said the court, to accept the argument that even the very important interest and confidentiality of presidential communications is significantly diminished by production of such material for in-camera inspection, with all protection that a district court will be obliged to provide, which in this particular case, through 3 litigations, has yet to have occurred. And those who possess some familiarity with the FOIA are all too well aware that Exemption 1 permits an agency to withhold matters from FOIA disclosure if such matters are specifically authorized under criteria established by an executive order to be kept secret in the interest of national defense or foreign policy, and B, are in fact properly classified pursuant to such executive order. While Exemption 3 shields matters specifically exempted from disclosure by statute, provided that such statute A requires that the matters be withheld from the public in such a manner as to leave no discretion on the issue, or B establishes particular criteria for withholding or refers to particular types of matters to be withheld. And that ends the inquiry. However, in this rather novel case, with a court-acknowledged protracted history, which had given rise to a search at the White House, which had, according to the sworn declaration, consumed 2 years, and which had warranted a personal security clearance, classification rather, of confidential. Neither Exemption 1 nor Exemption 3 had been invoked by the White House. And beyond the initial acknowledgement of receipt of the FOIA request, no further response would be issued, as corroborated in this sworn declaration filed under penalty of perjury and sanctioned in accordance with Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 11, until by letter dated January 26, 2024, over a year ago, with not even a mandate issued from the trial courts in the interim to enjoin the White House from withholding information, as indeed authorized under the FOIA, or when be issued its final, and with the exception of an acknowledgement of receipt only, response to the plaintiff's request, almost 3 years, to obtain information with respect to what even DOJ would describe as a simple, not complex request for documents. Former President Barack Obama, in his very first executive order, had directed agencies to adopt a presumption in favor of disclosure with regard to all FOIA decisions. Former President Obama had directed departments and agencies not to withhold information merely because public officials might be embarrassed by disclosure, because errors and failures might be revealed, or because of speculative or abstract fears. And he had instructed agencies to respond to requests promptly and in a spirit of cooperation, which clearly on the record has not happened here. Under Executive Order 12958, classified national security information promulgated by President William Jefferson Clinton on April 17, 1995, in no case shall information be classified in order to inter alia conceal violations of law, inefficiency, or administrative error, or to prevent embarrassment to a person, organization, or agency. And yet, with not even a single mention in the Free Press, through 3 initiated litigations, 1 going twice to the Supreme Court under the FOIA, under which the Congress has determined that on complaint, the District Court of the United States in the district has jurisdiction to enjoin the agency from withholding agency records and to order the production of any agency records improperly withheld from the complainant, and further, that any person making such a request to any agency record shall be deemed to have exhausted all of his administrative remedies with respect to such request if the agency fails as here to comply with the applicable time limit provisions. The White House has asserted a presumptive claim of executive privilege on a matter that bears a very close nexus to a novel virus that today has been attributed to more fatalities worldwide than Adolf Hitler in the Holocaust, and has elected a dubious right to remain silent. Prior to any question, the person must be warned that he indeed has a right to remain silent. And any statement he does make may be used as evidence against him, and that he has a right to the presence of an attorney, either retained or appointed by the court. Yet still, the fundamental requisite of due process of law is the opportunity to be heard, and that should occur at a meaningful time and in a meaningful manner. What do you think? This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.